Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan and today I'm going to be grading every single NHL team's offseason so far. Now every single NHL team made some big moves, whether they've gotten better, whether they've gotten worse, whether they've signed big free agents and let guys go, but throughout the entire NHL, which teams are the most improved, least improved, and which teams are the best and the worst offseasons in 2022. Watch till the end for all the picks and all the grades, and make sure you hit that subscribe button if you are new. 50% of you guys aren't subscribed, so if you like hockey content, this channel is the place to be. Now let's start today's video off with the Anaheim Ducks and their offseason grade. They're a team that coming into the free agency, coming into the offseason, had the most cap space in the entire league, and I think they made the most of it by the very end. They, of course, added players like Ryan Strome and Frank Vatrano onto that four-group players in the New York Rangers, and then at the very end of the offseason right now, they end up getting John Klingberg on a one-year, $7 million deal, and that type of change just completely overhauls the roster and overhauls that defense, and I think by the end of things they used their cap space pretty well. Now they did lose a couple of solid players like Sonny Milano, like Zach Aston Reese, but at the same time with their additions they're trying to, just like the Kings last year, go from a team that has been rebuilding into a true playoff contender, and those moves help it. I will give the Anaheim Ducks a grade of an A+, not the best grade of all the NHL teams, but I would say one of the better off seasons that any NHL team had. Next up, going to the Arizona Coyotes, who we knew were going to be a little bit less active when it comes to the free agent signings this year, but overall, I still think they did do pretty well. You obviously have a few additions like Nick Bjugstad, like Zach Aston, like Patrick Nemeth, in deals that they just brought on for cap reasons. They did lose quite a few solid players like Phil Kessel and I guess Jay Beagle for them, but let's be honest, this Coyotes offseason has pretty much gone to plan. Draft as high as possible, get as many picks as possible, and use the cap space well. And in that situation, I think they've done pretty decently. I'll give them a C+ grade. Overall, a pretty expected offseason for them. Next up, going to the Boston Bruins offseason, their grade for me personally is kind of up in the air right now. It could be a lot higher, it could be a lot lower, and that's just because both Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci are still rumored to be coming back to the team, but we don't know if they actually will be. I mean, they have $4.7 million of cap space, and I don't know if they're going to be able to fit both of those guys under the cap situation right now. Now, they obviously did make the deal where they got Pavel Zacha in exchange for Erik Haula. That was obviously the biggest deal the Bruins made, but besides that, we're just kind of waiting to see if Bergeron and Krejci are there. As for right now, I'll give the Bruins a D+, but hopefully by the end of the offseason, that'll be much higher. Now let's move on to the Buffalo Sabres, another team that hasn't made too many moves this offseason. They obviously re-signed Craig Anderson, they got Eric Comrie onto that goaltending tandem, and Ilya Lyubushkin is a pretty underrated signing for them, especially with the defensive and physical game he provides. They did end up losing Cullen Miller and Mark Pysyk, which provides less defensive depth, but you also have players like Owen Power coming into the full time, and I think for the Sabres team, they had the offseason they needed to, and you combine that with an absolutely brilliant 2022 draft, and I think they did pretty well overall. I'll give the Sabres a C+, nothing amazing because again their free agency wasn't all that active, but at the same time they needed to make some big moves on that goaltending tandem, and they did, re-signing Anderson and getting Comrie and adding him onto the roster. Now let's go on to one of the more interesting teams this offseason in the Calgary Flames, who have changed so much about the roster, it's honestly insane to think about. Obviously they ended up losing Matthew Tkachuk and Johnny Gaudreau, two big time forwards, but with the Jonathan Huberdeau trade, they ended up acquiring him and Mackenzie Weegar adding onto that defense, and they also added Kevin Rooney. And for a while, I thought the Calgary Flames had easily the worst offseason. I mean, they added Kevin Rooney, they had Matthew Tkachuk and Johnny Gaudreau likely going away from them, but, and this is the big thing, that Gaudreau, that Huberdeau trade changes the entire outlook of this next year, and with Huberdeau also being extended, that is huge news for the Flames. Still not an ideal offseason, but for me, when it comes to Calgary, it went from an F type of offseason to a C+. Overall, very decent. Considering the situation, I think for the Flames, that is a true success. Next up, let's go on to the Carolina Hurricanes, who in my opinion had some huge success this offseason. A team that needed to make some big moves onto that four-group and also in that offensive core, and they absolutely did. They obviously acquired Max Pacioretty for seemingly nothing. They added Brent Burns in a pretty great trade in my opinion for them. Andre Kasha is an underrated player, and Dylan Coghlan could be interesting too. They obviously lost a few key pieces, Tony DeAngelo, Vincent Trocheck, Max Domi being the biggest, but I do feel like even though they lose a little bit of depth, their star power is fantastic. And I think the Canes already, even with the depth that they've lost, they still have quite a bit on that bottom six and quite a bit of different play styles and uniqueness on the roster. And I feel like adding Max Pacioretty is going to be huge for that forward group, huge for the playoffs, and Brent Burns, with the experience he has, also is going to be insane on that defense and that power play. I'll give the Carolina Hurricanes a straight A because I thought they did really, really well considering their situation. Now on to the Chicago Blackhawks, and full tank mode is engaged for them. As you can obviously see, I mean, the departures, Alex DeBrincat, Kirby Dach, Calvin DeHaan, Dominic Kubalik, and Dylan Strome not being qualified, and the Blackhawks leaving them to go into free agency. And you can see the additions. I mean, Max Domi is a pretty interesting one. We'll see how Peter Mrazek plays. Colin Blackwell will get some playing time. But let's be honest, this entire Blackhawks offseason has been made to tank and to just line up these next few years of pure rebuilding. And I think for the Blackhawks, that's exactly what they needed to do. I still don't love the return of the Alex DeBrincat trade, but I do think the return of the Kirby Dach deal is pretty solid. But the Blackhawks, we now know what they're trying to do and trying to be, and I think the rebuild, it was a good time to do it. I'll give the Blackhawks offseason a C, even though I think it could have been better in some of the returns. I think it was inevitable that this was going to happen, and I'm glad the Blackhawks eventually pulled the trigger. Now moving on to the Colorado Avalanche, obviously winning the Stanley Cup. Those type of off seasons after a cup win are really fascinating to watch, and for the Avalanche, there's been quite a few big moves. Obviously, I think, in my opinion, I think the Avalanche actually did really well considering having all of these different free agents available and all these guys to sign. I think the Avalanche did a great job of signing the guys that they truly needed to. Players like Valeri Nichushkin, players like Arturi Lehkonen and Josh Manson, who I think will provide not just great value in this last cup run, but great value for years to come. And you get rid of Andre Burakovsky, Nazem Kadri. Those are two big blows to that forward group, but you have Arturi Lehkonen coming into the fold full time, which I think will be great for them. And I feel like even though I would love to have Kadri back, I'd love to have Burakovsky back if I'm Colorado, those are two players that I think have done their best play already with the Avs, and especially with Kadri, I think are going to be declining as these next few years go by. Meanwhile, for Nichushkin, he's still in his prime. Lehkonen is still in his prime, and they still have quite a bit of cap space that they can use for this next trade deadline. And you also, of course, add Georgiev, who is going to be on that tandem. I'll give the Colorado Avalanche a solid or a pretty decent B-. I think overall, considering their situations and the free agents they had, they did pretty well. Speaking of doing pretty well, let's go on to the Columbus Blue Jackets, who had some monstrous moves this offseason. Of course, Johnny Gaudreau is just a non-news story, but Eric Branson, the biggest addition to this Blue Jackets roster. But kidding aside, Johnny Gaudreau, in my opinion, even though for some people it might be an overpay, I feel like the Gaudreau deal, setting everything aside, is so important for this Columbus Blue Jackets franchise, a team that has lost so many big-time free agents, so many star players, is able to attract one of the best forwards and wingers in the entire league. And I think that is such a key thing for this Blue Jackets team, to show the league that they can still keep stars. They can actually add stars when they had the choice to go anywhere else. And I think that is such a great thing for this Blue Jackets franchise and such a great sign for things to come. You also, of course, add Eric Branson and two big defensemen from the 2022 draft, David Jiricek and Denton Metiachuk. And I think overall the Blue Jackets did very, very solid. But again, that Gaudreau signing, I think, is going to influence the Blue Jackets free agencies for a very long time. I'll give the Blue Jackets overall offseason an A-, not too shabby. Now going on to another team like the Bruins, whose offseason is kind of up in the air right now, in the Dallas Stars. From what we've seen so far, I've liked the moves. Adding Colin Miller, I think, is underrated, and Mason Marchment was, in my opinion, one of the more undervalued free agents available, and they were able to lock him up pretty solidly to, I think, a pretty good AAV. And even though you do lose John Klingberg, I feel like that is a subtraction the Stars needed to make. Kind of like Kadri, his best days are behind him, and I think the decline is just going to get worse and worse from here on out. But I do feel like the Stars offseason is incomplete. They still have not signed Ottinger, and they still have not signed Jason Robertson, which are two of the most valuable players on the roster. I'm going to give the Stars offseason a B-, but a lot of it depends on if they can re-sign both those guys. Next up, going on to the Detroit Red Wings, and in my opinion, they had one of the best off seasons of any NHL team. You obviously have Ben Chiarot, Andrew Copp, Ville Husso, Dominic Kubalik, David Perron, Ali Mata. To me, there were a lot of good, great moves, but also a lot of solid moves that teams like Detroit need to get to add to the depth. I mean, Dominic Kubalik is a great example, in my opinion, a player that in a great goal-scoring power play role can do so much good on an offense, and I feel like he is a great addition to that Red Wings team, and again, provides a lot more offensive depth that they would not have had usually. But you add players like David Perron, which I think are going to be huge on the team, players like Andrew Copp, and in my opinion, the Red Wings had the opportunity to spend big, and they did in the right ways, and I think this Red Wings team is vastly improved, and will hopefully be a playoff contender this next year in the Atlantic. I'm going to give the Red Wings grade an A+. I think they had one of the best off seasons of the entire NHL. Now going on to the Edmonton Oilers, who made quite a few interesting moves. Obviously, Jack Campbell is the biggest addition, and they've of course re-signed players like Jesse Puljujarvi and Kailer Yamamoto recently. I do think when it comes to the Oilers situation, we still have yet to see some moves unfolding. I still think we will see a trade eventually, but I do think for the Oilers overall, I'll give them a B. I just love the Jack Campbell signing. Finally, a hopefully consistent goaltender for the Oilers to rely upon, unlike players like Mike Smith, but we'll see what happens. I think that Campbell contract and that addition is going to be huge for the morale and huge for the goaltending going forward. Next up, going to the Florida Panthers, though, that had one of the most eventful off seasons, just like the Calgary Flames. Actually, I think like the Flames and the Panthers are kind of similar in that they have that huge trade involving Matthew Tkachuk and Jonathan Huberdeau, but a lot of losses on the depth side of things for Florida. Obviously, Ben Chiarot and Claude Giroux, we knew were going to leave in free agency. That was an inevitability, but Mason Marchment, I think, is going to be a huge loss for this Panthers team, especially when it comes to their depth and their intensity in the playoffs. Marchment was such an interesting player and such a hard player to play against, and I think it'll be a huge loss on that middle six, but you do have Matthew Tkachuk, who is even more of a Mason Marchment and more of an antagonist and will be so hard to play against in that Atlantic, and you got players like Nick Cousins, I guess. I mean, for the Panthers, they've lost a lot of depth, but I think the Matthew Tkachuk deal makes it a little bit better. I'll give the Florida Panthers a C- grade. Could have been much better, but also some of the losses were kind of inevitable. Next up, we got the LA Kings, who are another team that didn't really have as crazy of an offseason. Most of their moves really started at the start with Kevin Fiala and his trade going from Minnesota to the LA Kings, and in my opinion, that was an amazing trade for the Kings to make. They needed another great, consistent player on that top six, and Kevin Fiala is going to be a really interesting fit with the playmaking and the dual threat offense that he provides, and considering they had to give up Brock Faber in a second, I think Brock Faber would have been really nice to have. You're the Kings, and is one of the better defensive prospects in the NHL, but he isn't needed, and I think Kevin Fiala, especially with the direction the Kings are heading in, when they want to take those bigger next steps, will add to that offense so beautifully. I mean, you do lose Afanasio, you lose Faber, you lose Ali Mata, but that's depth that, in my opinion, the Kings can absolutely afford to lose. I'll give the Kings a B- grade, and overall, one of the better off seasons throughout the NHL. But now going on to an offseason that's kind of confused me a little bit in the Minnesota Wild. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, their cap situation is not amazing, but you look at some of the losses and the additions, it doesn't really add up in my opinion. Obviously, they added Brock Faber onto that defensive core and Philip Gustafsson in free agency, but you lose players like Nick Bjugstad, Kevin Fiala, Cam Talbot, and there's not really any replacements or many sizable replacements onto that roster. So they still have $4.3 million to work with, and even though in the future, in these next couple of years, their cap situation is screwed, this year they could have added more in my opinion, and even though I think they're definitely hedging their bets on players like Marco Rossi and Matthew Boldy becoming full-time NHL players and really rising up the ranks in the Wild depth chart, I still think that depth could have been improved upon, and I think that cap space could have been used a lot more efficiently. I'll give the Wild a D, because I think this offseason could have been much better for them. Now moving on to the Montreal Canadiens and Kent Hughes' first ever offseason as GM of the Habs, and I think he did really solid considering the situations. Now, he hasn't obviously gotten rid of players like Josh Anderson and some other cap crunching deals on the roster, but he actually ended up getting the Jeff Petrie deal done, and that was a huge deal for the cap situation. But you add Kirby Dach, you add players like Evgeny Dadonov, Mike Matheson, Yuri Slavkovsky, of course, in the draft. You get rid of players like Romanov, Jeff Petrie, Tyler Pitlick, Ryan Poehling, but in my opinion, the Habs have set themselves up amazingly for the future with this offseason, and again, you combine that great 2022 draft, I think the Habs rebuild and their retool is looking a lot better because of Kent Hughes' moves. I'll give the Montreal Canadiens an A-. Next, I'm going to a team that I think had a pretty sneaky offseason, all things considered, and the Nashville Predators, who, in my opinion, actually did really well. You added players like Kevin Lankinen, who I think can be underrated. I think his time in Chicago was really disastrous, and I think there's still potential there. Nino Niederreiter is still, in my opinion, one of the more underrated adds this offseason, has been a really underrated scorer for the Canes for a long time, and I think in Nashville can do the same. Ryan McDonagh, I still think has a lot of game left in him, even though he is a little bit overpaid. I think for the Preds, using that cap space, I think McDonagh is a good addition on that defense and a good leader as well. And Zach Sanford, who can play in a physical sense. You do lose Luke Kunin and David Rittich, but in my opinion, you add a guy like Lankinen who has the potential to be much better than Rittich, and players like Niederreiter and Ryan McDonagh. I think the Preds are much improved. I'm going to give their grade an A, and I think they did really well. And I literally didn't consider them to be as good until I looked at their moves entirely, but I think they've had a pretty stellar offseason. Now, speaking of stellar off-seasons, going on to the New Jersey Devils, who made quite a few big moves. Obviously, the Bruins trade we talked about, whereas Pavel Zacha going to Boston in exchange for Erik Haula. I think that makes the roster so much better. But you also combine the other additions. Vitek Vanacek gives them some much-needed goalie stability. Andre Palat is a huge addition and brings so much leadership experience and really exciting play that for the Devils, alongside centermen like Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes, is going to be so fun to watch, especially in year one. John Marino is a super under-the-radar addition, and in my opinion, can bring some stability on that defense that I think they desperately need. You also had Brendan Smith and you get Simona Metz in the draft, and in my opinion, the Devils had one of the more well-rounded off seasons. They had a solid goaltender, they had a great top 6 player, they had a great top 4 defenseman, and have a solid draft, and to me, I think they did really well. I'll give them a straight A, and I think the Devils did what they needed to, and more this offseason. Now, going on to the New York Islanders offseason, there's really not that much to report. I mean, they added Alexander Romanov, but they still have yet to sign players like Noah Dobson, and we still have yet to see how the Nazem Kadri situation concludes. He was obviously rumored to be going to the Islanders and a deal to be done, but it doesn't seem like that has happened yet. I'm going to give the Islanders a C, a straight C without the Kadri signing, but if Kadri is signed, I'll give the Islanders a B-, but they still have a lot of signings to make and a lot less time as this offseason goes by. Now, moving on to the New York Rangers, they had an offseason that, in my opinion, was pretty predictable. They lost a lot of depth, players like Ryan Strome, Cobb, Vetrano, Kevin Rooney, Justin Braun, Patrick Nemeth, Georgiev, but I think they did replace it decently. You get Vincent Trocheck, who will be a great second-line center in all situations for them. Ryan Carpenter is a solid fourth-line guy, and Yaroslav Halak, I still think has something to give, even if the last year for the Canucks wasn't all that great for him. I do think for the Rangers, it could have been better, maybe, but also I didn't think they needed to make sweeping, drastic moves. I'm going to give the Rangers a C+, overall, just decent. Now moving on to the Ottawa Senators, who had also, just like the Red Wings, a fantastic offseason. Overall, that Atlantic got really a lot more close in this offseason, and the Sens are a great example of that. They obviously added Alex DeBrincat for, in my opinion, still a steal of a deal. You add Claude Giroux, who, just like Johnny Gaudreau in Columbus, I think means so much to the future of this Sens team. Being able to bring in a great, experienced veteran on a deal like that is absolutely amazing, and the fact that Drew is hunting for a Stanley Cup and chose Ottawa is such a great sign for Sens fans and for that Sens organization. And again, just like Johnny Gaudreau in Columbus, I think we'll attract more free agents, or at least get more interest from free agents just because of that signing, and also the Cam Talbot deal, which I think is underrated, and another veteran that I think is needed on that Sens roster. Now, you do let go of Connor Brown. Matt Murray was also a loss for them, but I feel like overall they added some much needed superstardom on that four group, and Cam Talbot I think will be solid for them. Overall, a great offseason, and I give the Sens an A+. And I think there is also a conversation to be had. They have the best offseason in the entire league. I think it's between them and Detroit, but I could give the Sens the edge there. Now let's go on to maybe the best offseason in the NHL to the absolute worst of the entire league, the dumpster fire of the entire league, and the Philadelphia Flyers. Every single offseason with Chuck Fletcher seemingly somehow gets worse than the last, which I gotta respect with Fletcher. I mean, at least he's consistently bad and we know what to expect, but this has got to be one of the worst off seasons I have seen as a hockey fan. You add Nicolas Deslauriers, you add Tony DeAngelo, you add Justin Braun, you lose Martin Jones, but in my opinion, this Flyers team added in all the wrong situations. What do the Flyers need? They need defense and they need a lot more consistency throughout the lineup. You add Tony DeAngelo, who yes provides great offensive skill, but is one of the worst defensive players in the league. And you combine DeAngelo on a defense that has a case to be the worst in the league defensively, and there's no issues that are being solved there. Now Justin Braun being added, I think is pretty big for them and might be the only player playing defense there for gosh sakes. But at the same time, they added Deslauriers instead on the same day that the Blue Jackets ended up getting Johnny Gaudreau. And it's so fascinating because we heard Chuck Fletcher saying that he didn't have the cap space, he didn't have the room to sign Johnny Gaudreau, but in my opinion, it's the GM's job to make that space. There was so many conversations around trading James Van Riemsdyk, and we obviously saw Max Pacioretty at the same cap hit getting traded for nothing. I think for the Flyers, that was a deal they needed to make, that was a contract they needed to move out, and they didn't. And in my opinion, Chuck Fletcher is incompetent. He isn't making the moves the Flyers need, and I'm going to give Philadelphia a flat F. The worst offseason of the bunch, and deservedly so. Now, it is the most shocking thing in the world, but somehow the Pittsburgh Penguins had a better offseason than the Philadelphia Flyers and are doing a better job at constructing a hockey roster than the Philadelphia Flyers. That is crazy to think about. Almost like that's really been the case over the past 30 years. So the Penguins offseason I thought was pretty solid as well. You add players like Jeff Petrie, Jan Rutta I think is a really underrated signing, and Ty Smith I think will add a much needed skill onto that defense, especially of course with John Marino going to New Jersey. You obviously lose Mike Matheson, you lose John Marino, but in my opinion for the Penguins, I thought they did pretty solid, and I do like the acquisitions of Poehling and Archibald, and I do think those can add some much needed depth on the forward group, but really the most important thing is that they kept Malkin, they kept Letang, two guys that I think for the Penguins and their morale needed to keep, and those were probably the two biggest signings and moves for the Penguins this offseason. I give them an A-, and overall they did the job they needed to do. Now moving on to the Seattle Kraken, a team that also had some pretty major additions. They got Andre Burakovsky in free agency, Shane Wright, of course, in the 2022 draft, as well as Justin Schultz and Martin Jones. Now they did lose some depth there. You got Ryan Donato, Riley Shea, Daniel Sprong, Hayden Fleury is also a loss for them. But at the same time, I think they needed to add some stability on that forward group and add somebody that can play on that top six and actually create offense. And I think Andre Burakovsky is going to be really interesting and a really good power play player, especially for the Kraken over these next few years, and hopefully if they get a little more healthy and get a little more consistent together as a group, year two will be a lot more successful. I give the Kraken a B+, and overall, they actually added somebody on that forward group, and I think that was the most important thing. But I will say there is a little bit of missed potential there with that Kraken offseason. We heard that they were in on John Klingberg, and he only signed for 1 year, $7 million, and considering the Kraken's cap hit, I think they could have easily made that happen. But going on to the next team here in the San Jose Sharks, they had an offseason that I think was also kind of like Chicago's, an absolute inevitability. I have been saying over the past 3 seasons how badly the San Jose Sharks need to bite the bullet and rebuild. And as much as Mike Grier has made a couple of confusing moves, letting a couple players go, for instance, I feel like he is the guy that's finally putting his foot down and giving this Sharks team the rebuild that they need. Now, they still added some pretty decent players like Oscar Lindblom, Nico Sturm, Matt Benning, Aaron Dell, obviously coming back, and you obviously lose Brent Burns. But I think for this Sharks team, they need to go in a rebuilding direction, and I think everything has pointed to that finally being the case. I give the Sharks offseason a B+, but the fact that it seems like they're finally going in a retool and a full rebuild is the most important thing. Now, there's been a couple of teams that have had some missed potential, and speaking of that, let's go on to the St. Louis Blues, a team that's offseason was just kind of inconsistent for me. Now, in terms of their additions, they got Noel Acciari, Thomas Greiss, Josh Levo. I mean, I wish them the best with Thomas Greiss. One of the worst goaltenders in the league over these past 3 years with Detroit was absolutely horrendous. Maybe in a better defense, he does better, but I think he is a lost cause right now. But you lose players like Tyler Bozak, Ville Husso, and David Perron. Perron is the most important loss for them, and in my opinion, they are really going to feel that presence lost on that forward group. And considering their cap situation, situation. I get why they weren't able to keep players like Perron, and they're obviously going to want to see bigger roles for players like Thomas and Giroux and all the younger players, but at the same time, losing Perron really hurts, and I think that really puts a damper on this Blues offseason. I give them a D. It could have been worse, but I also think that their team got a lot worse this offseason, and that's really the biggest thing for a team that's still wanting to win the Stanley Cup as much as possible. Now moving on to the Tampa Bay Lightning, and another team that in my opinion got a lot worse this offseason. Now for the Lightning, I think they have a lot more excuses because they needed to actually make these moves. They were even going to get close to cap compliant, and they're still minus 7 million from the cap, and that's a little bit of a concerning thing. But they did add Ian Cole and Vladislav Mestikov coming back to the roster, which I think is a couple of really interesting additions. But they do lose Ryan McDonough. Andre Palat is a huge loss in my opinion, and Jan Ruda really is a tough loss for the depth of that defense. But I think overall, considering the situation the Lightning needed to go through, it wasn't the worst in the world, but I still give them a C-. Now moving on to the Toronto Maple Leafs and their offseason, I will say this, I don't think they got much better or much worse, but there are a lot of changes that I think could make this roster next year much worse or much better. There's a lot of question marks right now with this Leafs roster, and really all goes back to the goaltending that they decided to come up with this offseason. They obviously signed Ilya Samsonov, and they end up trading for Matt Murray, which is two heck of a gambles to make. And I will say, if it works out, I think it could be one of the better situations goaltending-wise in the league. I think Samsonov still has potential, but has been rather disappointing and underwhelming in his time with Washington. And with Matt Murray, the health has been a huge question in Ottawa. He has played good in spurts, but we'll see what he does in Toronto, but that's going to be the biggest question marks for the team. Overall, they also had a couple of other additions, a couple other subtractions, but really the goaltending is the biggest situation. I'm going to give them a C right now, but it could be much worse or much better depending on how they play. But now going on to a team that had a relatively simple offseason in the Vancouver Canucks, obviously signing a Russian free agent Andrei Kuzmenko, and also getting Ilya Mikheyev, which I think is, although an overpay, I think a player that will be great and a solid goal scorer, let's hope, on that middle six. Curtis Lazar was a little bit of a confusing one in terms of the term, but I think he can still be a solid player on that bottom six. You do lose Halak, but I think for the Canucks, there weren't many options out there, but I do think the situations and the contracts they signed were just decent. I'll give them a C+, and overall a solid offseason for Vancouver. But now going on to another team that had an absolutely brutal offseason in the Vegas Golden Knights. You can see with the key players added absolutely nobody, and the players lost Max Pacioretty and Dylan Coghlan, and they're still minus $2.7 million below the cap or over the cap, and it's crazy to think about because they still have Nicholas Waugh and they still have Nick Hague to sign. They still have two pretty decent RFAs that they have yet to sign, that have yet to be added onto that roster, and they're still $1.27 million over the cap. And considering they got absolutely nothing for Max Pacioretty, I give the Vegas Golden Knights an F off-season grade. I get maybe the argument that they had to make those type of trades, but at the same time, it hasn't really resulted in much of a better outlook for me, at least. Now going on to the Washington Capitals, another team that's really in the depths over the cap, but at the same time, their moves just plainly have been really interesting. Connor Brown, I think, was a great addition for them. Dylan Strome is a really underrated addition. You've got players like Eric Gustafsson and Darcy Kemper being out of that goaltending tandem, which I think is huge. That's the type of goaltender that I think the Capitals have desperately needed, and they get somebody that can lead in big situations and be good in the big moments. Obviously, you lose some depth in Justin Schultz, Ilya Samsonov, and Vitek Vanacek, but I feel like the Kemper and Lindgren pairing could be quite solid and maybe even better than what they had before. I'm going to give the Capitals an A-, and I think the Caps, considering their cap situation and what they had to go with, I think the additions they made on both the forward group and the goaltending are huge. But next up, going on to the Winnipeg Jets, and the last team to talk about here, another team kind of like Minnesota that I think had some real missed potential. You add David Rittich and you lose Eric Comrie and Paul Stastny, but they have $8.4 million of cap, and they only have to sign Mason Appleton, and he'll probably get maybe around $2 million, let's say. And I think for the Jets, it's a really missed opportunity. I mean, I really don't know what Winnipeg is trying to do. Are they trying to get much better? Are they trying to be worse? And in my opinion, it just every single time goes up to the fact that they're just trying to be the most mediocre team in the league. Because you look at the additions and the losses, there's nothing to report. They're the exact same mediocre slob that they've been over the past few years, right on to next season. And in my opinion, they're just biding their time. Cheveldayoff is just biding his time and just sleeping until he eventually gets fired and is phoning it in for a paycheck. Because seriously, what is this offseason supposed to be? What is this supposed to mean for the Jets? They're not going to be much better next year. They're not going to be much worse. It's just going to be the status quo, and sadly, the same status quo that we've seen over really the past like 3 seasons. It's going to be another mediocre season for Winnipeg, so I'm going to give them a D. Horrible for them. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you didn't enjoy the grades, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Comment down below, what do you guys agree and disagree with my grades for the offseason? What would you grade your favorite NHL team? And what would be your grades across the league? Let me know your thoughts down below. Share this video with your friends. Get it to all the hockey fans you guys know online. And click this card for all my hockey rankings content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.